I want to speak to you today about a fundamental mistake people have in their understanding about Judaism. And very often it's Jews as well that have this very, very great misunderstanding. And it's very critical that we understand this well, especially today. I mean, it's always been important, but in contrast to what we see in the Islamic faith, and also in understanding what many anti-Semites claim about the Jewish people from different quotes from the Torah and from the Talmud. So they pull out all of these quotes from the Torah and the Talmud about the Judaism being just as violent as Islam. So the first thing we have to notice and acknowledge, if we're going to be honest in this conversation, and then that's going to raise a big question, and that is that the Islamic faith from its outset, from Muhammad himself, who was a violent person, until today in any Islamic country that's ruled under religious law, they violently punish people in the most horrific way possible, which is just even hard to even digest. They will counter, well, the Torah says the same thing. The Jews are no different. Here's the reality. The reality is that in all of the history of the Jewish people, going all the way back to Moses, we have no record of the Jewish people punishing their people. Practically, I'm saying practically and actually punishing their people in these violent ways, other than some very, very rare circumstances. Outside of those, this is not at all an ongoing way of society, of Jewish society. Why is that? Now, it is true that in the Torah we have capital punishment and we have mention of very harsh punishments that should be executed by a Jewish court. However, they haven't been. Why is that? Is that because we're just not following the Torah? We liberalize the religion, as unfortunately some movements like to do? And the answer is no. That's actually not it. Actually, we follow the Torah very strictly. The question is, are we understanding what the Torah is saying, or are we just simply reading a text without understanding the fullness of what that text is saying? And that is exactly what is going on. And I'm going to give you some very clear examples so that if you've ever struggled with this idea, you're going to understand very, very simply and very well from this week's Torah portion of Mishpatim, which means laws, Book of Exodus, chapter 21, where you will see very clearly that the way most people read what the Torah says is simply not what it's saying, and that's because they don't know how to study the Torah. And this is true for all of the anti-Semites that go out there and say the Talmud says this and that, and they call Gentiles this and that. They simply don't understand the context of things, and therefore they don't understand what the Talmud is saying. So let's begin, though, with this very interesting conversation. It's about a 4-minute clip that I'm going to share with you on a podcast between a Christian and a Muslim. You're going to hear the harshness of the Muslim. Of course, he speaks as a Westerner, so it's toned down. But he essentially, and I'm not showing you the whole conversation, but he essentially acknowledges that this person deserves to be put to death according to Islamic law. But being that they're not living in an Islamic country, he wouldn't be put to death. But that's what he acknowledges, just to understand the vantage point of where this guy is coming from, which is pretty scary to think about. But here's the conversation, and then a very a major statement that the Christian guy says, which is absolutely wrong, and I want to clarify that point. Here we go.
I was standing up for the freedom of speech. 2015, Pamela Geller and I put on in Texas a Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest. And it was actually, we featured a lot of classic Shiite Persian art depicting Muhammad, as well as contemporary art that was from a more critical standpoint. And a couple of jihadis came from Phoenix, key members, actually, of the Islamic Community Center of Phoenix. One of them was featured in a recruitment video for them, and they tried to kill us. And so I actually would be also under a death sentence just for drawing Muhammad and for sponsoring people who do, which I did not in order to cause gratuitous insult, but to defend the freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which is the foundation of any genuinely free society.
Daniel, what would you say to that? What's your response to that?
Yeah, so just a few points here. Number one, it's interesting how we want to talk about Islam as a religion, but the religion is 95%, like what Jake mentioned. It's about worshiping God, being devoted to a righteous way of life, loving your neighbors, taking care of your parents. That's what 95% of Islam is about. Yes, there are criminal punishments, which we're going to discuss. There is conquest, there is war theory, there's all of this in Islam. But it's interesting how when a conversation is about Islam, we focus on that 5% instead of the 95% of what Islam is about. We don't see this kind of double standard with like Christians. So if you have someone like Matt Walsh is a traditional Christian. There's slavery in the Bible. There's punishment for blasphemers in the Bible. There's killing of heretics in the church tradition. There's no discussion of that with Matt Walsh, right? Or Ben Shapiro. There is killing of blasphemers in the Hebrew Bible. There is, punishments for apostasy in the Talmud. There's no discussion of that with Ben Shapiro. You can talk about, other values, and that's what the discussion focuses on. But the Islamophobic narrative is just lasering in on these specific topics, which is fine. We can discuss that, but I just want to note the double standard. So the other framing of this whole discussion that I want to put out here, though, is that I'm wondering, like this standard of, there should be no punishment for blasphemy, for example. Let's just put that out there. There should be no punishment for mocking and insulting a religion, attacking people's values. Is that coming from a Christian perspective? Is that coming from is that coming from the church tradition? Is that coming from the Bible? Because when we look at the Bible, we see in Leviticus, we see in Deuteronomy that blasphemers should be put to death. Even if you entice, the Bible says, if you entice like your son or your daughter or your wife entices you to worship other than God, then have no mercy. Put them to death without due process mentioned, without any kind of court or tribunal. The husband or the father should just immediately put them to death without mercy. That's what the Bible says. So when Robert wants to criticize Islam, I'm wondering, is that criticism on the basis of the Bible? Is that on the basis of the church tradition? Or is this a liberal, secular, modernist critique of Islam? So I want to know, am I debating or discussing with two Christians or two atheists or two liberal secularists? Like, that's a clarification that we need.
May I?
Yes.
This is a very important clarification, and there are a couple of distinctions that have to be made. One is all of your examples from Christianity are from Old Testament law, which if you had studied Christianity, you would know there's no sect of Christianity, no school of Christian thought, no tradition within Christianity that holds that Old Testament law applies to Christians for all time. As a matter of fact, it never did apply. Even in Judaism, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the rabbis redefined Judaism so that even they don't teach that those punishments have ongoing validity.
And this is exactly the point where I'm going to stop it, although this conversation continues in a very fascinating and actually scary way. And that is that he says that the rabbis redefined the Torah, God forbid, because they did not redefine it, but that's what he says, that they redefined the Torah to tone it down. Nonsense. And we know it's nonsense because there is no record of, in fact, the Talmud states that if there was a court that enacted the capital punishment, which the Torah speaks about in many places, once in 70 years, that court would be referred to as a murderous court. That's how infrequent it was for capital punishment to actually be implemented. And there are many details as to why, because the Torah requires many circumstances. God set up that you need many different circumstances in order to actually implement capital punishment, which are virtually impossible to come by. So ultimately, it doesn't happen. Well, then why would God give capital punishment and then prevent the ability to actually realistically implement the capital punishment? I'm going to get to that very, very soon. And this is very significant, actually. The answer to that question, the question is a great question. And the answer to that question is a very important one. But here's the first thing I want to demonstrate to you. So you can begin to see how to study the Torah. So when we read a verse that seems to be saying something, we don't necessarily understand what it's saying unless we know how to study the Torah, which is part of what every Jewish child who goes to yeshiva is taught through the study of the Torah and the study of the Mishnah and the study of the Talmud, which is all critical in order to understand all of this. We have the Torah tells us something in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 18 and 19. If two men are fighting and one hits his friend, right, and with a stone, he says, or with a fist, and he doesn't kill the other person, but he injures him. We know that because the guy gets up from his bed ultimately, and he has to compensate with workman's comp and his medical bills. That's simply what the verse says. And then just 2 verses later, the Torah tells us another occurrence, another scenario, that if 2 men are fighting and one swings to hit his friend and mistakenly now, it's a very different scenario, hits a pregnant woman and causes the fetus to die. So he kills the fetus. You know what the Torah says? If there was a fatal injury that happened by accident, v'nasata nefesh tachat nefesh, a soul for a soul. You may have heard this famous quote from the Torah, a soul for a soul. And the more famous quote is the very next verse. And then it says, an eye for an eye, ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth, yad tachas yad, a hand for a hand, regel tachas regel, a foot for a foot, and continues. Next verse. Kviya tachas kviya, pega tachas patza tachas chabura. It continues to say that you give the person exactly what they did. So what is the verse saying? An eye for an eye, a foot for a foot, a leg for a leg. Now, there is no Jewish court that ever, when one person, caused another person to lose their hand, chopped off their hand, which is what they do in Islamic countries, actually, which is horrific. But doesn't the Torah say that? We need to understand. Now, let's go back to the story that we're talking about. There were 2 men fighting, and one swung and missed and hit a pregnant woman and caused the fetus to die. So we say a soul for a soul, which would imply, it would seem that you kill this person who killed the fetus, right? And the answer is wrong. Never in Jewish law, and nowhere in Jewish law does it state that that's what you do. In fact, what it states in Jewish law is that you assess the value, monetary value. Over here, I'm not going to go into the details of what's involved in how you assess that. But however you assess that, you assess some monetary value, and the person has to pay that amount of money. That's what Jewish courts always did from the times of Moses. That's what every single book of Jewish law and every Talmud, anywhere that speaks about the result of this verse, says what you do. Well, you'll ask, why is that? So Maimonides, who you may know and may have even quoted, and I want you to know, if you're quoting Maimonides and you trust him, then trust him across the board. Maimonides explains, and he's not saying a novel idea of his own. He's only explaining what it says throughout Jewish history and all rabbis who preceded him. So he explains that it's obvious from the text that it's a monetary punishment and we don't kill the person who killed the fetus. How do we know this? Because in this incident, this man killed the fetus mistakenly. It was an accident. He wasn't trying to hit the woman. He was trying to hit his fellow man, right? We just had a previous story where 2 men are fighting and one man hits his friend deliberately, right? And what does the Torah say? The punishment is financial, monetary compensation. So now, and right afterwards, it tells the story about an accident, and you're going to tell me over there's capital punishment, but by a deliberate act, there isn't capital punishment? Obviously, that's not the case. Now, you may have a question, then why does the Torah say a soul for a soul? I'm going to get to that. I'll give you a very simple and clear explanation about that. But before we get there, it's clear, and that's the reason, actually, why the Torah juxtaposed these 2 stories. It puts them right one side by side for us to understand that a soul, nefesh, tachat nefesh, does not mean a soul in place of a soul. Don't make that. That would be a grave mistake to make, and that is wrong. And Maimonides adds, and I'm going to read the translation. I could read you the Hebrew, which I have in front of me, but I'm going to read the translation. Though this is obvious from the text itself, as I just explained it to you, we have also heard this from Moses, who explained the text this way. So it was practiced in every Jewish court, in the court of Joshua, the successor of Moses, the court of Samuel, and in every Jewish court from the time of Moses to this very day. There was no court that made any other judgment. Why? Because when God gave Moses the written law, which says a soul for a soul, God also gave Moses the oral law, which is information explaining what the Torah means. Because much of the Torah we don't understand without explanation in this thoroughly. We may think we understand it, but we don't. And that's why it would be foolish for anyone to just read the Torah and say, I understand what the Torah is saying. You must study it with the oral law. And the oral law is, part of that is what we call halacha l'Moshe miSinai, which are laws given to Moses at Sinai, and also the explanations of the laws in the Torah itself, where Moses taught that when a man, mistakenly kills a fetus, that you don't take the person's life. That's not what the Torah means when it says a soul for a soul, but it means monetary compensation. Okay, fascinatingly, and just some more evidence. I'm just going to pile on a little bit more evidence that this is absolutely the way it is, and why no court ever judged it differently, is because we know something else too in the Torah. The Torah, in a number of places, explains to us that if one man kills another man inadvertently, we call it b'shogeg in Hebrew, bishkaga, that's mistakenly. Right? He didn't intend to. There was an accident and he did. You know what that person has to do? He has to run to a city of refuge. And again, I'm not going to go into the details of what a city of refuge is, but there were designated cities in Israel where a person would have to run to. And as long as he is in the city of refuge, he is safe. But if he leaves the city of refuge, a blood relative would have the right to take revenge and kill the person, even though it wouldn't be the most admirable thing for a blood relative to do, but they would have the right to actually avenge the death of their beloved and kill this person if he was outside of a city of refuge. So he has to sit in a city of refuge for a certain amount of time, which is a separate conversation. So we see that if you kill someone mistakenly, you don't get the capital punishment. The Torah is very clear about that. So to think that in this case where the Torah says a man kills a fetus by mistake, a soul for a soul means that he gets killed, would be an enormous contradiction to the very standards that the Torah establishes in numerous other places. And here's something else. Here's another thing. The Torah, here's the first explanation to why the Torah says nefesh tachat nefesh, a soul in place of a soul. Because when the Torah uses words, those words have far deeper meaning than just the one level of the literal translation. It has much deeper meaning. And here's one example. The Vilna Gaon, the great Gaon of Vilna, Rabbi Aryeh of Vilna, who lived about 300 years ago. Less actually, about 200 and some odd years ago. He explains that the word tachat means under. When the verse says ayin, in eye, tachat, ayin, in place of an eye, which is the famous quote that everyone knows, an eye for an eye, right? So what he said, the word tachat is saying, the word tachat means under, right? So it's saying take the letters under ayin, and you will understand the meaning of the verse. Meaning that the word ayin, which means an eye, it has three letters to it. It has an ayin, a yud, and a nun. If you take the three letters after the letter after each one of those, the letter following ayin is a pei. The letter following yud is a kaf, and the letter following nun is a samach. Those three letters, that is samach, pei, kaf, samach, spells out the word kesef. What does kesef mean? Money. So we see even alluded to in a hidden manner the allusion to the idea that eye for an eye means money. It doesn't mean literally taking out the other person's eye, right? This is the magic of Hebrew, of biblical Hebrew, which we call the Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, because it has embedded within it this entire mystery of multiple levels of meaning. And lastly, why? So, many people are bothered by the fact, well, why don't you just say that? Why do you have to confuse us? Here's the reason why. Because when God is expressing something in the Torah, he's doing more than just giving us a practical method of punishment implementation. God's giving us much more than that. He's giving us sentiment, how to feel about a certain circumstance and situation. And what that means is that God wants us to understand that even though the actual implementation of punishment, when one person takes out, God forbid, knocks out someone else's eye, is that you don't knock out their eye, but they have to pay monetary compensation. Just like if someone, God forbid, causes another person to lose their hand, we don't then take off their hand, but we require them to pay monetary compensation, right? However, I want you to understand, God is saying to us that what you have done is much more serious than a monetary issue. Because if you see the punishment as monetary, you may think, well, it's a monetary issue. You'll diminish the gravity of what you've done. So God says, I want to use words which are on a much more intense level of life and death. So you understand when you take someone's hand away, it's like taking part of their life away. That's the reason why God, on one hand, he uses words which seem to imply that the punishment will be on a life level. But on the other hand, the reality is that the punishment is not a life level, but it's a monetary level. So Rav Kook was the first Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, and he was once asked this question, and he explained something brilliant. He said, you know that when a father hears that his son did something he should not have done, the father, is about to raise his hand to hit his son, raise a stick to hit him, at least in the good old days, right, to punish his son. And the mother comes running, stop. I feel bad for him. Don't hit him. Leave him alone. He didn't understand, whatever it may be, right? And what happens? The father doesn't hit him. Another man may come by and say, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you hit him? Right? It was a whole waste. Your kid did something wrong and there was no punishment executed. What is the truth? The truth is that there was punishment executed. You know why? Because everything that the father wanted to achieve was achieved, while also not needing to hit his son. Because the son experienced that what he did was so severe that his father was going to hit him. His father was going to hit him, but his father didn't hit him because of the compassion that a mother has for her child, and ultimately a father also has for a child. But the message still has to get across that the son has to understand that he really deserves a spanking for this. And that is what God wants to get across to us as well. That really there is a deserving of a spanking here, of a much more serious punishment. I'm not going to give it to you. I'm not going to give it to you, but I want you to understand the severity of what you did to understand that really that is also what is deserving. And we find another scenario, where the Torah tells us, also in this week's Torah portion, if you have a bull, which is a muad, it's known as, which is a bull which is habitually gores. So the owner already knows from a history that this bull, gores, and the owner had been warned about its bull and didn't guard it, and it kills a man or woman. It kills a human being, his bull, right? So the Torah says the bull shall be stoned, and its owner shall be put to death. That's what the Torah says. Is an owner put to death when their bull kills somebody? The answer is no, that's not the law. The law is he has to make monetary compensation to the family of the person who is killed. And the Torah says it right afterwards. The Torah explicitly says that he pays kofer yushasalav, that he has to pay a monetary redemption. So you may ask, well, then why does the Torah say he should be put to death if he's not being put to death? Right? Well, here's the thing. We speak simply and clearly, or at least we attempt to. And so we're very open and explicit about things. But the Torah is trying to accomplish a lot more than just explicit directions. It's trying to express meaning and significance to things as well. And therefore, when the Torah says something, even though it may frustrate you because you say, why did you say that if that's not what you mean? Well, in some respect, it is what God means. So I want you to know that if you have a bull that you know is a goring bull and you don't protect it properly and it ends up killing another person, in some respect, at least spiritually, I consider it as if you murdered somebody. No, it's not on the level that you will get capital punishment. Ultimately, you will compensate monetarily, but on a spiritual level, something very severe happened over here. Now you have an understanding of how we read the Torah and how the Torah works, and why it is that the culture in Judaism and the law, actual law in Judaism, has always been appropriate and gentle, and the Jewish and the Jews as a society have actually brought civilization to the civilized, because we have been the most civilized of people before people knew how to be civilized. And why it is that tragically the Islamic culture and faith remains as dangerous as it is, and doing the most horrific things to their own people, and what they would do to you and I if they had the power to. And when they do, they actually do that. Now you understand the rest of the story.